Tad, are you there?
Yes, I am. Ready to go.
I'll introduce myself and then let you introduce yourself. I'm John Horgan. I'm a correspondent on science for Blogging Heads TV. And with me today is Thomas Homer-Dixon of the University of Toronto, at least temporarily. And I guess you go by the nickname Tad?
That's correct. That's right.
So could you briefly introduce yourself to the Blogging Heads audience?
Sure. I am a professor of political science currently at the University of Toronto, and I have been there for about 20 years and running a program in peace and conflict studies that later became the Trudeau Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Toronto. And I've been interested for a long time in the sources of conflict, in the causes of violence around the world, and especially in the relationship between nature and environmental stress, resource scarcities, and violence. More recently, I've spent a lot of time looking at the factors that influence how societies adapt to complex stresses of all kinds, not just environmental and resource stresses, but economic and technological stress. And that's led me into work on complex adaptive systems theory and looking a lot at the sources of innovation, how societies innovate, how companies innovate, and how people can be resilient and flexible in response to all kinds of rapid changes that we have going on around us.
Mm-hmm. May I just ask you, was there anything in your childhood or upbringing that led to your interest in war and conflict?
Well, I actually grew up in a very peaceful part of the world. I grew up in Victoria, British Columbia in the late 50s and during the 1960s. And it was probably one of the places in the world that was most removed from any of the conflict or turmoil around the planet at that time. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the reasons that I was always very interested in the state of the world and in what causes people to fight each other is precisely because this was a very peaceful part of the world, and people seem to get along in my corner of the world, and so I always thought it was rather bizarre and peculiar that people could be so murderous in other places, because I wasn't prepared to believe that they were somehow fundamentally different from me. Mm-hmm. So there must be circumstances, I decided, in which people become very violent, and I was always very interested in that. The other thing that I brought from my childhood was a really deep interest in the natural world. My mother passed away when I was fairly young, but she was a naturalist. She was trained as both a zoologist and a botanist. She was an artist and an illustrator of wildlife. My father was a forester. He's still alive, but during his career he was a forester for a water supply region for the city that was nearby where I lived, Victoria, and so he had to develop practices for forestry within that water supply region that were sustainable and that were ecologically sound, a long time before people were learning about that kind of thing and even thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And so I had a chance to spend a huge amount of my time outdoors in a natural environment on the west coast of Canada that is one of the most spectacular in the world.
Yeah, you're very fortunate to be out there. I've only been there a few times, but I loved it while I was there. So I just wanted, before we get to your most recent book, The Upside of Down, could you just briefly talk about your first two books, which seem to kind of lay the foundation for some of the ideas in your most recent book? So the very first book is Environment, Scarcity, and Violence. And then the next one was The Ingenuity Gap. So can you just tell us briefly what those two books were about, and then we'll move on to your most recent book.
Absolutely. So I did my undergraduate education in Canada and then went on to do my doctoral work at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And there I focused on, really dug into the issues of conflict and the sources of violence, especially the nature of group identity violence between groups violent conflicts that involve a lot of we-they dynamics. And towards the end of that doctoral research, I decided to try to bring these two deep interests together, the interest in conflict and the interest in environmental issues and environmental stress. And when I came, after I finished my doctorate and I came back to Canada, to the University of Toronto, I decided to look specifically at how environmental stress might cause violence, especially in poor countries. The kind of environmental stress I was interested in was water scarcity, degradation of cropland, shortages of fuel wood because of deforestation. And over a period of about 10 years, I ran quite a large international research project involving about 100 researchers around the world that did a lot of case studies looking at these links in really disparate areas, from the Gaza Strip, looking at water scarcity, to deforestation and land degradation in the uplands Philippines, to whether, for instance, land scarcity contributed to the Rwandan genocide. And the first book, Environment, Scarcity, and Violence, which was published by Princeton in 1999, was really a summary and a synopsis, a sort of synthesis, in a sense, of all of that work, bringing it all together and identifying some general patterns that we had seen around the world. That book still is widely cited and is widely used by people working on the links between resources and environment and social instability and political violence. Now, one thing I realized during that work, and this was really fundamental, is that some societies adjust relatively well to environmental stress, and others seem to have terrible trouble. And so I became increasingly interested in what the factors were that determined whether a society could adapt well or not. And that led to the second stage of my work, which focused on the issues I mentioned earlier. What are the factors that influence the rate of innovation within societies and the ability of societies to adjust and adapt to stresses like resource scarcities, water scarcity, degraded land? Because some societies do it well and some don't. And that question resulted in work on what I call ingenuity theory, and it produced the book that was titled The Ingenuity Gap. And the argument there...
When was that?
That was published by Knopf in both Canada and the United States in 2000. And the argument there is basically that for some kinds of problems, it seems... Now, I should say that I was expanding beyond environmental problems in poor countries at this point. I was looking at a whole range of stresses that societies might face, and not just poor countries in the third world, but rich and poor countries. And I suggested that there are some circumstances in which human beings basically are creating problems that are harder than they can solve, that they can't deliver in the right times and places the solutions they need for their problems. And so I looked at both why the problems are rapidly becoming harder, and also why we can't deliver those solutions, what the impediments are to delivering the right kinds of solutions at the right times and places. And that became a very large enterprise. And that particular work occupied me for a period of about 10 years, almost a dozen years.
Let me just ask you, when it came to finding an audience for your books, or getting grants and that sort of thing, in the 1990s, was that difficult? I mean, it seems that now, post 9/11, post invasion of Iraq, everybody is in a state of constant anxiety and crisis, and we lots of us feel, whether legitimately or not, that the world could end any moment. But in the 1990s, at least in retrospect, everything seemed pretty good. So there were these conflicts in distant places, and in the Balkans and Rwanda. But overall, it seemed like the world was becoming more and more prosperous and peaceful. Did you feel like you were... was it difficult to get your message across, that there were these potential problems out there?
Well, yes and no. And we really need to distinguish between the first stage of the work, which was on environmental stress and violence, and the second stage, which was the work on complex adaptation, as I call it now, and the ingenuity gap. The first work, which developed from basically the early 1990s until 1997, 1998, was developed in a period of time where the Cold War had ended, and many policymakers were looking for new kinds of conceptual tools to think about the state of the world and what the security problems of tomorrow might be like. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that just by serendipity, in many ways, we happen to be, in a sense, the right people at the right time with interesting ideas. And so the work on environmental stress and violence that we were doing at that time received an enormous amount of attention. Mm-hmm. And during the Clinton administration, we were able to do deep analysis of conflicts like the Rwandan genocide, of the conflict in Chiapas, Mexico, of the Philippines situation, of Indonesia, China, and other places, that fed right into both Canadian and American and also English foreign policy. Mm-hmm. We were doing regular trips from Canada to Washington. We were briefing the CIA, the National Security Council, the State Department, right up to the level of Vice President Al Gore.
Oh, really?
And that was an exciting time for a young researcher, and I would take my even younger researchers to Washington, and we were well received, and I think our analysis, for the most part, was pretty good. I'd certainly adjust some of it now, but I think that it has stood the test of time.
Yeah.
Now, the second stage of my research on the ingenuity gap is a somewhat different story, because you're absolutely right. Especially in the late 1990s, this was a time in the United States of enormous optimism, of a sense that America stood astride the world, had mastered the challenges and problems that it faced, was not just a new hegemon, but had basically defined an economic system and a political system and a way of life that could potentially produce, as Francis Fukuyama suggested, the end of history.
Yeah.
And it was interesting how my book, The Ingenuity Gap, was received. It was a bestseller in Canada. Went right to the number one in the bestseller list and received major awards. In the United States, it sold adequately, but many Americans responded by saying, what is this nonsense that we face an ingenuity gap, that we can't solve our problems, because we're able to do anything and we can solve any problems.
Right.
It's true that in retrospect that seems rather hubristic, it seems rather silly. Now we know that the United States is a deeply challenged society, both internally and externally. But in those days, there was a sense that there were no limits, that there was no limit to possibility. And I think the ingenuity gap actually struggled a bit in that environment.
It's funny that some books do well because they oppose the zeitgeist, but if you oppose it too much, people won't even listen to what you have to say.
That's a very important point, and I think that often the people who produce bestsellers repeatedly are capable of judging exactly where that boundary is and remaining just on the inside. So their work is interesting and challenging, but not so different that it's incomprehensible. And I think unfortunately, in many respects, at that particular time, my book, The Ingenuity Gap, was across that boundary and was somewhat incomprehensible in the American culture at the time.
I just wanted to ask you about the issue of resource scarcity and warfare. So I have been writing about the anthropology of conflict and war since the late 1980s. The first piece I did was on the work of Napoleon Chagnon on the Yanomamo, this very violent tribe in the Amazon. And as I'm sure you know, there's been this endless debate among anthropologists, and I'm sure this is there's a reflection of this in political science as well, over whether war is really over resources or whether other factors are at least as important. So Chagnon, writing about this tribe in the Amazon, said that it was mainly about male status and competition for what he called reproductive resources, which is basically women. So you often had fights that would start over a wife, a woman. One guy was trying to steal another guy's woman, and then that would lead to a killing, which would lead to revenge killings and raids and counter raids and so forth. And then people would sometimes forget what the original cause of the war would be, and it would just sort of perpetuate itself. Chagnon said that resources had nothing to do with it, and that these people tended to be quite well fed, had plenty of game, they grew little plots of different vegetables and so forth. And there's a real split in the anthropological community, and there are certainly some areas where you had lots of population growth and intense competition for resources, and that wouldn't necessarily lead to more conflict. Other places where you had pretty sparse populations, plenty of food, and people would fight like crazy. So I just wonder where how important are resources, how important are some other factors in causing war?
Well, I think you've put the question really well. And to get right to sort of the central issue, I think that it's misguided, and a lot of researchers are guilty of this sin, you might say. It's misguided to look for a single factor in the cause of any human social behavior, especially conflict. There are always multiple factors in every single case. Mm-hmm. And any time you try to develop a generalization, you should really pay attention to multiple factors. Now, the thing is, you can identify some circumstances in which conflicts occur and resources are abundant, and other circumstances in which conflicts are resources are scarce, and conflict doesn't occur. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that resources are irrelevant in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
And that's a really important point. You see, people are always looking for a single cause, and they're looking for something that is both a necessary cause and a sufficient. Mm-hmm. It's necessary in the sense that it's always there in every instance of conflict. And it's sufficient in that if you've just got it by itself, you always get conflict.
Yeah.
The fact remains that in any kind of social phenomenon, including conflict, there's no such thing as a necessary and sufficient cause. You tend to get clusters of factors. And in clusters of factors, sometimes resource scarcity might be a powerful factor, and sometimes it might not be in the cluster of factors at all. Mm-hmm. There are many, many different routes to conflict. In fact, I teach a whole course on this, and we go through 13 major theories of conflict, each one of which explains certain kinds of conflict. Now, the conflicts might actually all look more or less the same, but you can get to that kind of conflict or to the phenomenon of conflict by many different causal routes.
Yes.
Some of those causal routes certainly do involve resources. If you combine resource scarcity with certain other kinds of factors, and I could, of course, because I've studied this for a long time, go into a great deal of detail, far more than your viewers would probably tolerate. But if you combine resource scarcity with certain other factors, you have a very high probability of conflict. Mm-hmm. In other circumstances, resource scarcity might not make that much difference. And in fact, it's that kind of thing that I was going after in this book, The Ingenuity Gap. What is it that determines that people or societies can adapt well to scarcity, and in other circumstances they don't?
Yeah.
So I think of it very much in terms of sort of the multiplication of several factors together. So you could take factor A, B, and C, and you need A times B times C. C might be resource scarcity. But you have to have both A and B there at the same time for C to contribute to conflict. If A or B doesn't exist, then you don't get conflict. If any one of those in a multiplication arrangement like that, if any one of those factors is zero, you don't get the result. Yeah. That's the best way of thinking about it. And it turns out that the most sophisticated thinkers about social phenomena, including conflict, use that kind of what we call a product term, notion of causation, that you need several factors and they interact multiplicatively. And if any one doesn't exist, then you don't get the phenomenon that you're interested in. And there may be many different sets like A, B, C. You may also have D times E times F and S times T times P. All different kinds of sets of factors, all of which can lead to conflict. It's a very complicated story, within the journalistic communities and within the communities of policymakers and public policy commentators, everybody wants to reduce the phenomenon to a single factor. And ultimately you get bad policy as a result, and bad commentary and bad public understandings of these phenomena.
There does seem to be this tendency of conflict to, once it begins, to perpetuate itself in a way that has nothing to do with the original causes. I mean, you see this time and again. There was a very disturbing article by Jared Diamond in the New Yorker within just the last few weeks. I'll link to it on the Blogging Head site about feuding among tribes in New Guinea. So he's worked among these people for decades, and I guess the feuding has continued right into the modern era. And Diamond talks about this one young man who I think had some education and had gone to a town to go to college and had a job. And then he found out that a relative of his had been killed in one of these sort of ritualistic wars they had. And that meant that he had to avenge that killing. And so he went back and he found out who was responsible. And he didn't kill the person, but he paralyzed him for life. I guess he threw a spear at the guy and it stuck in his back. And the article was sort of about the pleasures of vengeance and how extremely difficult it is to eradicate this really primal human urge.
Absolutely. No, I agree completely. In fact, we can't divorce conflict, not only just from the sort of material factors, the natural resources and factors like that are external to communities, but also to the psychological responses and even the genetic predispositions that people have to certain kinds of circumstances. I think vengeance and the desire for it is really hardwired into human beings. And you can see these conflicts that may start over something like resource scarcity or in Chagnon's case, the shortage of the resource of reproductive females. And then they perpetuate themselves because of the back and forth, the action-reaction of attack and vengeance and vengeance in return between two groups. Now, one of the concerns I actually have in the world today is that as weapons technologies of various kinds improve, especially light weapons, it becomes easier and easier for one person or a small group of people to do terrible harm to larger and larger numbers of people more efficiently and more quickly, which means you invoke in the people who are attacked that kind of vengeance response. And of course they have access to the same weapons and can go out and hurt far larger numbers of people in their attacks of vengeance than would have been possible previously. Yeah. And so you see in certain parts of the world, in significant part because of the availability of weapons, more or less perpetual conflicts that have given human nature and this desire for vengeance almost no possibility of dying out. And they can go on. I mean, even in the Amazon and in New Guinea, these conflicts can go on with primitive weapons for generations and generations. When people have assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades, they can go on, I think, more or less forever. And that's a real concern. And notice here is a really good example of the kind of thing I was talking about before. We have an interaction, a multiplication between a technological development and an innate characteristic of human beings.
Yeah.
And that has made the problem vastly worse than either one of those things would have by itself.
Although one of the few optimistic factoids, it makes me optimistic that I've come upon in war studies is that mortality rates in the 20th century from war are about an order of magnitude less than they are among the Yanomamo and some of these other tribal societies.
That's right. Steve Pinker has done some interesting work on this, and even in the 20th century up into this part of the 21st century, we've seen More or less, over the last 15 years, a steady decline in mortality from violent death around the world. It's a very different world than it was even in relatively recent history.
Well, so we should get to your most recent book. I'm holding it up now in front of the screen. This is The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity, and the Renewal of Civilization. This was originally published 2 years ago, is that right?
It was published in 2006, towards the end of 2006. And then the English editions and the Australian editions came out in 2007, during the summer.
Okay, so I finished reading the book last week, and I really enjoyed it, although the word enjoy maybe isn't the best
I hear that frequently,
word to use. Because it's, I mean, you probably also hear this frequently. It could have been the downside of up. This book reminded me a little bit of Jared. Actually, it reminded me quite a bit of Jared Diamond's book Collapse, which I felt was trying to be constructive and positive and upbeat, but the sort of negative, scary sections had a bigger impact on me than the positive, upbeat ones, the ones that are sort of trying to extract useful lessons from all the catastrophic failures of the past. So could you just say why, and maybe I'll go back to some of my responses as we keep talking about it, but what did you want to say in this book that you hadn't said in your previous two books?
Well, the first thing I need to say is that this book, The Upside of Down, and The Ingenuity Gap are actually very different from my first book, Environment, Scarcity, and Violence. That first one was an academic book, published by an academic press. I decided at that time to shift to writing for a general audience and publishing trade books for a period of time in my career. And I recognize now that there are really three books in this series. The Ingenuity Gap, The Upside of Down, and my next book, which as yet remains untitled. And the first two books, The Ingenuity Gap and The Upside of Down, are really developing an analysis or a theory of the circumstances we find ourselves in and the challenges we face. When I began The Upside of Down, and this, I think, gets directly to the comment you just made, I expected to include both an analysis of our situation and a lot of solutions and prescriptions in the book. Mm-hmm. But after having written over 300 pages and more or less having only just finished my analysis, I'd run out of time, I'd run out of space, I'd run out of resources to actually do the prescriptions portion. But I don't regret that, because I think what The Upside of Down does is it provides, I think, and people have compared it to Jared Diamond's Collapse, and I'm not going to speak negatively about Collapse because I think it's a terrific book, but I think The Upside of Down provides a more coherent and sophisticated theory of what the challenge we face is and why we're really at risk of significant breakdown of major systems on this planet. Social, economic, and ecological systems. Yeah. There is a fairly elaborate and detailed theory of societal collapse, drawing on many different bodies of research: political science, sociology, economics, ecology, anthropology, that's developed in this book. And that's brought all together in the latter chapters of the book.
I wonder if you... sorry, I just wanted to ask you about the analogy that you developed in the very beginning between the Roman Empire and our current status. So it's I don't think you really say Roman Empire versus the United States. It's more sort of the Roman Empire, correct me if I'm wrong, and modern nation states in general.
That's right.
But I really found that fascinating. I wonder if you can describe what went wrong with Rome and what the lessons are for the current era.
Well, lots of people, of course, compare, for instance, the United States today with Rome, and Cullen Murphy has recently written a piece in, I believe, the Atlantic Monthly about a year and a half ago that asked, "Are we Rome?" And I think it's a legitimate question, but I think a lot of people get the analysis wrong, and they look at the wrong things. And so what I try to do in The Upside of Down is look in particular at the deep material conditions of the Roman Empire, in particular at energy flows within the empire. Mm-hmm. And I think in energy in rather expansive terms. I think about energy in expansive terms. I think of it as a master resource, mm-hmm. the most important of all our resources, that enables human beings and societies to respond to their problems by developing more complex institutions and technologies. And as societies grow and expand, they tend to become more complex, and they need higher inputs of high-quality energy. In the Roman case, over an extended period of time, they were able to obtain this energy largely by expanding their territory and raiding the treasuries of empires that they conquered. But there's one important thing that needs to be understood here, one important distinction between Rome and our current situation. And this is what makes Rome particularly interesting. Rome is what you would call a proximate solar society. It was agrarian. All of the energy that it used to build its buildings, to construct its cities, to maintain its urban populations, to maintain its bureaucracies, and to solve its problems of various kinds, including its problems of security by maintaining and moving an army around all over the Mediterranean. All of that was provided by food. And it was food that was grown in fields. So essentially, Rome converted a significant portion of the Mediterranean basin into agricultural land. It was like solar panels that provided food energy in the form of grain, which we could think of as energy batteries that could be moved around the Mediterranean and used for various purposes.
No, I just have to ask you. I found that such an interesting way of looking at a society, thinking of food as a form of energy that sort of is the engine driving the society. And is that original to you, or has anybody else talked about Rome or any basically agrarian society in that way?
Oh, it's discussed all the time by people who do this kind of work, especially anthropologists, and one in particular, Joseph Tainter, whose work I use a fair amount in the book, is one of the foundation stones of my general theory. Joseph Tainter published in 1998 a classic book titled The Collapse of Complex Societies. And at the core of Tainter's argument is an analysis of flows of energy in societies and how societies use energy to build their complexity, and how over time, according to his argument, that complexity becomes less and less effective in solving a society's problems. Mm-hmm. In economist terms, you get diminishing returns to complexity. But complexity is also becoming more and more expensive in terms of energy that's used to generate it. Now, what does that mean? In the Roman terms, it meant that the cities became extraordinarily large and very elaborate, and then required large bureaucracies to run, and there were very large populations in the major cities that depended upon free grain handouts. This just gives you a sense for what we're talking about here. The city of Rome, when it was at its largest, probably in the early part of the first millennium, so between 0 and 100 A.D., the city of Rome probably exceeded 1 million people in population, and may have even gone as high as 1.5 million people. No city even approached that population until the Industrial Revolution. And the Roman Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula itself had an urban population that represented about 20% of the whole population. In the province of Egypt in Rome, the urban population represented almost 30% of the total population. No other agrarian society in history has been able to exceed 5%. Why? Because it takes an enormous amount of subsistence farming to generate sufficient surplus to maintain an urban population. The Romans had to organize themselves extremely efficiently and run their countryside very effectively to extract enough grain from the countryside to provide a surplus to maintain those huge urban populations. Now that is an interesting question in itself. But what happened over time, through the 1st, 2nd, and the 3rd century AD, is that Rome became so complex that it couldn't supply sufficient energy to sustain itself, to, for instance, maintain its military, which by the end of the 3rd century AD was almost 600,000 men. The military alone required 200,000 tons of grain a year to support. Okay. Now, growing grain in those days was not the kind of operation that we engage in now. This was all done by horse-drawn plows and oxen-drawn plows. It was hard work, manual labor and labor with animals in the fields. And then any grain that was produced that was a surplus on that particular farm and wasn't eaten by the people who were working that farm had to be carried, of course, over land by oxen in carts and accumulated in grain storage facilities. And then, for instance, Rome was the recipient of grain that was shipped from Egypt and from northern Africa and from Sicily, often at great hazard across the Mediterranean. In fact, there's some wonderful stories about how there would be scouts and runners observing the horizon of the sea south of Rome in the early days of spring to see whether the convoys of great grain-bearing sailing ships were coming from Egypt and from northern Africa, because usually in the early centuries of the first millennium, by the time you got into spring, Rome was very close to running out of food. The city of Rome was very close to running out of food. And as soon as they saw those convoys, the runners would go back to Rome, and apparently the whole city, all the way up to the emperor, sort of breathed a sigh of relief that they were going to be fed for the subsequent year.
Well, there's just a question that I had about this. I wanted to see if I read you correctly. The sense I got from your analysis was that there is something almost determined about how the requirements for maintaining a society, you need more and more energy, then you need to add complexity to your society, which in turn means that you need more energy to maintain that added complexity. And as a result of this, you get a declining, what you call, energy return on investment. So whether the energy is food or oil or solar power, anything, that you're going to get less for any particular unit of energy as the society evolves and becomes more complex. And it seems the way that you presented this model, it did seem quite deterministic, and it seemed hard to see how we could escape this trap unless we find new sources of energy that are much cheaper and more efficient and so forth. So just, how much is your model, how much hope does it offer for escaping this sort of endless cycle of added complexity and less energy return on investment?
Well, there's certainly material constraints, and this is an important point. I don't think that they are insurmountable, but if we are going to surmount them, any society is going to surmount them, including Rome. The first thing you need to do is recognize that they're there. And the Romans didn't effectively. And even if they had, they probably wouldn't have been able to respond effectively given the nature of their economy. But you've pointed to a very important concept that I discuss at length in the book, and that is the concept of energy return on investment. This is the idea that to get energy, you have to invest a certain amount of energy. Mm-hmm. And to give you an example, in the 1930s in Texas, when the great oil fields in Texas were discovered, drillers got back about 100 barrels of oil for every barrel of oil of energy they invested to drill down into the ground and pump oil out. Now, many years later in the United States, the energy return on investment for conventional oil is around 17 to 1. You get only about 17 barrels of oil back for every barrel of oil of energy you invest. Many of our other energy sources now, the new ones, have even lower energy returns on investment. The tar sands in Alberta, for example, give you an EROI of around 4 to 1. Corn-based ethanol gives you an EROI of around 1 to 1. Now, here's the key point.
I'm sorry. If it's 1 to 1, what's the point?
The point is, it's a great subsidy for the farming sector.
I see. Okay.
It's as simple as that. That's why we do it. We don't do it because it produces good energy. We do it for political and social reasons, but we disguise it as saying it's good for energy security. But overall, when you actually do the full analysis of how much energy you're putting into the tractors, how much energy you're putting into the irrigation, how much energy you're putting into the processing of the corn into ethanol, you add it all up, and you're getting about as much energy out as you're putting in. It's actually a pretty stupid energy technology.
That's a great statistic to know. What offhand, do you know what the EROI, or what's the figure for nuclear power?
Well, there's a big dispute about that. And it depends what you include, and this is an important point in general, it depends what you include in the analysis. Some people would say that the EROI for nuclear is pretty good, perhaps 20 or 30 to 1. But in many cases, what's happening when they do those calculations is that they're not including certain things that I think should be included, such as disposal of the waste and decommissioning of the reactor once it's exhausted. Now, we haven't decommissioned a lot of large reactors yet, but it's going to be a big job. Yeah. We're going to have to use robots to cut things apart because they're so highly radioactive, and then we're going to have to ship highly radioactive material across the countryside and dig, big pits or something like that to dispose of it in. And we not only do we not really know how to do this, but we can pretty well guarantee that whatever we do is going to take a huge amount of energy. When you add all of that into the calculation, then the EROI for nuclear starts to look not so good.
Right.
But this is a really important question, and one reason I spend some time elaborating this concept in the book is because I want people to get the point. And here's the really important general point. As a society moves down that slope, slides down that slope in terms of its overall EROI, energy return on investment, for all the sources of energy in its economy, as it moves from, say, 100 to 1 to 17 to 1 to 4 to 1 towards 1 to 1, it's using a larger and larger fraction of the wealth and the capital in its economy simply to produce energy, and it's got less left over to solve all its other problems, which may be becoming more and more complex. Now, that's what was happening to Rome. Rome faced an EROI crisis, an energy return on investment crisis, especially as it couldn't seize more highly productive territories. As the expansion of the empire stopped, it found that it couldn't sustain itself on the food supply that it could generate within its own boundaries. And as its energy return on investment declined, it started to have all kinds of problems in terms of maintaining its army, maintaining its bureaucracy, maintaining the complexity of its cities. In very simple terms, it became an enormous fiscal crisis for the empire. And there were attempts to solve that crisis. The Emperor Diocletian, for example, towards the end of the 3rd century AD, basically regimented the entire territory of the Mediterranean basin. He sent surveyors out to identify every scrap of agricultural land. Every scrap of agricultural land was then assigned to a particular cultivator, a family, or a farmer, and that person was identified with a certain tax rate, and they had to cultivate the land, and they had to provide that amount of grain every year. And if they died or they couldn't do it, then the land was assigned to somebody else, all the way up to the local village, which was then responsible for providing the tax. And as a result of that regimentation, which was highly militarized, by the way, they were able to extract larger amounts of energy from the Mediterranean basin to sustain the empire for a period of about another 80 years. But at that point, they weren't able to do it anymore. The complexity had increased to such an extent, and the burden on the peasantry had increased to such an extent that you saw a population collapse in the countryside, and that was pretty well the end of the Western Roman Empire anyway. Now, you made a very important point in your question. Is this deterministic? Well, there was a lot, actually, of energy lying around that Rome wasn't exploiting in the form of, say, coal, but even more importantly, petroleum. Huge resources in the Mediterranean basin of petroleum. But they didn't have the technology to turn that into usable energy. The question for us now, and we are facing a very serious energy return on investment situation in our own global economy right now. It's one of the reasons that oil prices are going up so sharply. It's just to explain that. Oil companies are having to go further into more hostile environments to drill deeper for smaller amounts of lower quality oil. That means that the energy return on investment in general for conventional oil, which provides almost half of the world's energy, is dropping steadily around the planet. Now, the question for us is there an alternative energy source that we can tap into, like there was for Rome in the form of petroleum, which it didn't have the technology to use effectively, but is there another source of energy that we could invent a technology to exploit that would allow us to get out of this trap that we're in right now? And I think that's very much an open question. In the absence of a technological breakthrough on the energy front, what we're going to see in coming decades is exactly the kind of thing that Diocletian did. We're going to see a regimentation of the surface of the planet. The big energy-consuming regions of the world, Europe, China, the United States and Japan, the big energy importers are going to go out across the surface of the planet, and they're going to buy up, control militarily, seize if necessary, every remaining scrap of petroleum energy in order to maintain complexity at the core of their societies. And that, of course, will lead eventually, I think, to some conflict. What form it takes, I don't know. But we're in desperate need here of some kind of significant breakthrough on the energy technology front in order to avoid that kind of petroleum-based conflict between really energy-hungry superpowers around the world.
I just had a guest on Blogging Heads a few weeks ago, Michael Schellenberger, who, with a guy named Ted Nordhaus, wrote an essay called The Death of Environmentalism. They turned it into a book that came out last year called Breakthrough. And it's a critique of conventional or sort of traditional environmentalism. And they say that too many environmentalists are sort of anti-progress, anti-science and technology, and that the way to solve our environmental problems is to embrace research and technology. And they have a specific plan they call the Apollo Project, and they've gotten Barack Obama interested in it. And they call for, I think it's a $300 billion investment over the next 10 years in alternative energy research. So I just wonder if you think, is that something that you think is a good idea, or is that even enough, or what's your solution for solving this coming energy crisis? Actually, it's not coming; it's already upon us.
The proposal is on the right track. I actually think the investment is too low. Mm-hmm. $300 billion over 10 years, $30 billion a year. In terms of the size of the American economy, the kind of investment that's being made, for instance, in fighting the war in Iraq, it's actually a trivial investment.
Yeah.
We have seen a progressive decline in real terms in investment in energy R&D over the last 20 years or so, at a time when we need that investment. Because there are long lag times in producing returns, we need that investment more than ever before. I think that we're actually in a situation where we need to mobilize very large amounts of capital. The scale that you would see when a society faces an existential crisis of some kind, for instance, a major war. Mm-hmm. We need to mobilize capital of that kind of scale in order to address this problem. And we need to try a lot of different things, a lot of different experimentation across a broad range of possible technologies, because we don't know really at this point where the breakthroughs might occur. In fact, it's probably going to mean that we need several different kinds of breakthroughs in order to get to where we need to be. People don't understand the scale of our energy problem. Our energy consumption within our modern societies and around the world is absolutely staggering. And it all depends. Our prosperity fundamentally depends on our ability to produce large amounts of energy. And now we have this extra constraint, of course. We have to produce large amounts of energy without wrecking the global climate by generating large amounts of carbon dioxide. In fact, climate scientists are now saying that we need to move to zero carbon output as quickly as possible. And that makes the energy challenge even more difficult. We not only have a declining energy return on investment for some of our major energy sources, such as petroleum and natural gas, but we have to solve that problem in the context of not being essentially able to use other fossil fuels, including coal. Or if we do use coal, we've got to figure out some really clever ways of using it, for instance, by pumping carbon dioxide that's generated underground. This, I think, to be frank, John, is probably one of the most difficult and serious challenges the species has ever faced, and it's coming down the pike at high speed towards us right now, and we are not, for the most part, recognizing the seriousness of the problem and generating the resources that we need to respond to it effectively.
See, now you're scaring me all over again. While we're waiting for these breakthroughs in energy technologies, and who knows if they will ever arrive. I'm optimistic they will, but let's say it takes a couple of decades. In the meantime, there may be all sorts of crises that arise, and you spell a lot of those out in your book. One of the really fascinating sections was when you talked about the issue of connectivity. So you were at one of these meetings where all these sort of technocrats and corporate moguls got together and are spelling out their visions for the future. And some guy, you said he was a Silicon Valley, billionaire, somebody like that, said the more connectivity we have, the better. And you described how you started brooding over this, and you pretty quickly decided that was just false.
Well,
the more connectivity, the better. So I wonder if you can describe, or if you can say, what's the downside of global connectivity?
Well, it was a pretty good example of the kind of shibboleth or aphorism that people use and to kind of establish a truth around which we can anchor our understanding of the world. And normally simplistic statements like that just get us into a lot of trouble. In the book, when I talk about that particular episode, I talk about it in the context of an incident that had just occurred. This was a conference in California, and on the way to the conference, I'd been driving on a freeway south in California, very fast, and I'd been in the fast lane in that freeway, and I was in a brand new rental car, and my engine went dead. And it actually, I came very close to buying it before I got myself off the highway, because everybody was tailgating around me, and there was absolutely, and I had no power, and I had to weave my way from the fast lane off to the side of the highway through a whole bunch of cars that were tailgating. That was essentially a highly connected, or what specialists would call a tightly coupled system that we had created on that highway. When everybody travels at high speed, tailgating on a highway, if somebody makes a mistake or an engine goes dead or something like that, you can end up with a huge multi-car pileup with lots of people killed, because nobody has the ability to respond to sudden surprises or shocks in the system because they're following the car in front of them too closely. And that illustrates the general point, and that was why I reacted quite negatively to the person who was on that panel with me, because I had literally just come out of this situation, arrived at the conference, and he made this silly statement that the more connectivity, the better. The thing is, when you get too much connectivity in a system, the system starts to become vulnerable to cascading failures, basically like a row of dominoes falling over. A shock in one part of the system propagates across the whole system and causes problems a long way away and often very fast.
This is like the great Northeast blackout of 2003.
Absolutely. In fact, I use that example. You have a small perturbation in the grid in Ohio, and within literally a few seconds, you've got a blackout that's affecting 30 or 40 million people. Other examples, for instance, the same year, 2003, would be the development of SARS in China, which within a week spread to Toronto and shut down the medical system in Toronto. And there are other examples. In fact, we've just witnessed something that's been pretty scary in the last few months in terms of a contagion within the global financial system. It seems like every half dozen years or so we have a crisis in the global financial system that people are saying is the worst since the Great Depression, and we seem to be hanging on the edges of our seats, hoping that the Federal Reserve and other central banks can save us from the contagion effect because of people panicking and running for the exits all at the same time. And that's, to a large extent, because we've now created a global economy that is astonishingly tightly coupled, where there are flows of information and capital instantaneously back and forth from one side of the planet to another, from one economy to another. At a certain point, connectivity can actually, if it gets too high and the coupling is too tight, it can actually lower the resilience of a system and make it more susceptible to cascading failures. And I think there are many circumstances where we see that in the world today. The most resilient systems have some connectivity, and that allows, for instance, if there's a shock in the system, let's say a food system is a good example. You don't want to have to grow all your own food all the time, either as a household or a village or as a particular region, because there may be some time when you have a drought or a climate problem or a pest or an infestation, and you need to be able to go and buy food somewhere else. So you need enough connectivity in the system to be able to shift resources across the food system, for example, move food around to help areas that aren't doing so well. On the other hand, you don't want too much connectivity, because if you get a really closely coupled system, then if you get a pest or something in one part of the system, it can spread very rapidly to the rest of it. I mean, look at what happened recently, just in, I think it was in 2001 with foot and mouth disease in England.
Yes.
That spread from one side of the food grid to another and caused enormous disruption to the whole livestock industry in England because it was so tightly coupled.
Well, and of course there's also psychological disruption that is propagated by the media. So sometimes you get sort of pseudo scares that create waves of panic.
That's right.
That are destructive in themselves.
In fact, I've talked about that in some of my research in the context of my work on terrorism, that we have now created a psychological and electronic network among ourselves that amplifies, that causes the same kind of cascading crisis and amplifies fear across whole networks. The most resilient systems are those that are kind of like Goldilocks' bowl of porridge that's just the right temperature. Not too connected, but they are connected somewhat. They're connected somewhat so they can share resources, but they're not so connected that they are vulnerable to these kinds of domino-like cascading failures.
You know, I just have to tell you, by the time I got to the end of your book, I was in such a state of anxiety. I thought that I should take certain steps to protect myself and my family against the impending collapse of civilization. So, and let me just tell you what I was thinking of doing, and you tell me if these are good ideas or not. I should first of all sell all the stocks that I have in my 401k or whatever, and put them in. I was thinking gold coins at first, but then if civilization really collapses, I'd probably be better off just stockpiling food and ammo. Get some guns and lots of bullets, water. I should probably dig a shelter of some kind. Maybe get a big vicious dog, because it just seems you present so many different scenarios. You don't just have one kind of big, most likely scenario. Because of this connectivity issue, there's so many ways that different assaults on on global civilization that can set off a collapse that kind of circles the globe. We've got to protect ourselves against so many different conceivable things that maybe we should all become survivalists. So, are you a survivalist yourself? And if not, why aren't you?
Well, it's a terrific question, and the answer is no, I'm not. I've done a few things, like our electrical grid here in Ontario is becoming increasingly unstable because of underinvestment in power production, as we're seeing in many wealthy areas of the world. So I've got myself a standalone generator for the household.
Oh, I got myself one after the big blackout in 2003.
Absolutely.
That was a great investment.
I should tell you that all of these little things are basically about increasing one's resilience in the face of potential shock, and it's not a bad thing. I'd like to be able to take care of myself for a few days if, for instance, those tractor trailers aren't bringing food in from California and Florida to Ontario. Resilience is about individuals and households and communities and regions being able to supply somewhat more of their essential needs. Not all of them necessarily, but at least somewhat more. I'm not a survivalist because I think the idea that we can have anything approximating an adequate life, a life that is worth living by ourselves in isolation from the rest of the world, is just silly. Yeah. Somehow we're going to have to figure out how to address these challenges collectively. And I should say, the first step, and I understand the reaction that you had from the book, and honestly, I had the same sort of reaction in writing these chapters. It was enormously difficult because in many cases, the deeper you get into these particular topics, the worse things look. And you find that the specialists in each one of these individual areas, whether we're talking about energy or climate or global economics, the ones who are really deep in the subject area are deeply, deeply pessimistic and distressed themselves.
Yeah.
So you add that all together and it becomes a rather grim story. But here's why I think there's no reason for immediate despair and running for the hills and digging a bunker. I think that there are going to be times of real difficulty, and there are going to be crisis, and there are going to be moments of breakdown and shock in the future. But those are opportunities for... Oh dear. My son has just arrived, and he seems to be without any attention. And can we just cut it and start again?
All right. So can you just go back to
Yeah.
Why you're not heading for the hills?
Just thinking. Okay. They can probably use some of what I said, right? I don't have to start at the beginning.
No.
Yeah. Okay. While I think there are going to be some times of real disruption and crisis in the future, even significant forms of breakdown, economic, technological, social breakdown in some parts of the world, I don't think that's a reason necessarily to despair or to run for the hills, because we know from experience, historical experience, that it's often in times of crisis when human beings are their most creative, when they pull together and are most effective in making the real changes in the way they behave in their institutions and technologies. It's sometimes in these moments when you really have your back to the wall, when you face the greatest dangers in life, and when societies face existential threats, that they actually respond in the most creative ways and make the most important changes, which is why the book is titled The Upside of Down. I don't think we're going to get out of the situation we're in without significant crisis and disruption in the future. We can't know what that's going to look like, but we can start thinking about how we would respond in different circumstances, and planning now for how we're going to try to take advantage of those opportunities provided by crisis in the future. And here I think is a very important point. If we just wait until the crisis occurs, then when things start to go a bit haywire, we can be sure that extremists of various kinds will be ready to go. They'll be well organized and networked together. They'll know what they want. They'll have resources set aside. And they'll be ready to take advantage of the situation. They're liable to seize the political and social terrain, so to speak, the psychological terrain, define the situation in terms of who the bad guys are and whom we should attack to respond to the challenges and crisis we face. If we don't want that kind of world in the future, where extremists hold sway in a time of crisis, then we need to start thinking, those of us who are non-extremists, and I think most people aren't extremists, we need to start organizing ourselves and thinking now about what we're going to do when that moment occurs in the future. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I think that's the most important point of the upside of down, that the time to start preparing for these difficulties is now, rather than waiting until they're upon us, and then all of us saying, oh dear, the situation's really difficult, this is a really bad world we're in right now, what are we going to do? At that point, it might well be too late to do anything effective at all.
I just want to give you a chance to briefly describe your next book. I think you said it was on open architecture democracy, which is a really intriguing phrase.
Well, the next book, as I mentioned early on, there really is almost kind of a trilogy here, The Ingenuity Gap, The Upside of Down, and my next book, which still has to be titled. But it's going to really focus on what we need to do. Mm-hmm. And whereas The Upside of Down basically makes the argument, difficult times are coming, but that's not necessarily the end of the world. It might be the time in which we can make the real changes that we need to make if we're prepared. The next book is going to talk about what it means to be prepared and what we should be doing now in response. And there are a whole range of things I'm going to suggest, but one of those that I think is ultimately most interesting is what I refer to as open architecture democracy. Now, this would be taking some of what we have learned in the open source movement and trying to apply it to solving very difficult problems that we face collectively as societies, our energy and climate problems, involving not just thousands or tens of thousands, but perhaps tens of millions of people in democratic problem solving and discussion. Mm-hmm. And it involves a certain reflection on the nature of the internet and where we are with the internet right now. At the very time, human beings are facing perhaps the gravest challenges that they've ever faced in the history of the species. We actually happen to have on this planet, for the first time, a rudimentary architecture for species-wide democracy, and that is the internet. But we're not using it effectively. For the most part, the internet is kind of a venue for a cacophony of narcissism. Not Blogging Heads TV, I might say. But the bottom line is, we spend a lot of time flaming at each other and raving at each other and beating each other up on the internet and just strutting around with our egos. But you look in certain places and you see phenomena where the whole is more than the sum of the parts, where you get groups of people together who are producing something that none of them can produce individually. Mm-hmm. And often that's a function of an open source or a wiki architecture.
Wiki democracy, I like it.
Well, a number of people are starting to think in this direction, but I don't think they're thinking, honestly, I don't think they fully unpack the idea. And one of the things I hope to do in my next book is develop, at least initially, some ideas for how we could use the internet for large-scale problem solving, but also, most fundamentally, for planning now for those crises in the future, mm-hmm. so that when they happen, we actually have some sense of what we should do collectively. Because here is kind of the central principle that I think underlies all of this. The challenge that human beings face more than anything else is not a technological challenge. It's about organizing basically decent people to do the right things. Sometimes they do in the right institutional structure, sometimes they don't. Right at the moment, we're making a mess out of the global climate because we haven't organized ourselves to pay the right price for energy, especially fossil fuel energy. These are big challenges, but they're not insurmountable. And there are many, many examples where human beings have solved equivalent challenges in the past. And we can do this. It's mostly about how we organize our problem-solving ability, and that's why I think that open source problem-solving offers one of the most promising avenues. It may well turn out that we look back a century from now and think and reflect on open source as one of the most important social innovations of this era. It's really quite remarkable what is accomplished in some of these places. Just very quickly as an example. if somebody had said 10 years ago, we're going to create an encyclopedia that's going to have millions of entries, it's going to be based on the internet, the culture of participation in this exercise is going to be collaborative and voluntary, and for the most part, people will leave their egos at the door. We're going to run this project for 10 years. Let's say actually we'll run it for 6 years, and then we'll bring in some experts from the scientific journal Nature, and they will determine that the science entries in the encyclopedia are just about as good as the Encyclopedia Britannica's. If somebody had said that 10 years ago, we'd have said that's nonsense. That's impossible. Human beings aren't like that. And yet there it is. It's Wikipedia. And for the most part, I think it's remarkably good. There's a situation where the whole is more than the sum of the parts. In so many places in the world, what you see, as you add more and more people together, they seem to behave more and more stupidly. But there's some places where you see the opposite occurring. And that's mostly about the architecture of decision-making and problem-solving. That's something that I hope to unpack in some detail in my next book, because it's one of the true rays of hope and rays of light that I see for our future.
Okay, so the important thing is to get that book published before the shit hits the fan. So get going on that book, okay?
I'm certainly planning to get it out as quickly as possible.
Okay.
And thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
I really enjoyed it, Ted, and hope we can stay in touch, and glad that I could introduce you to the audience of Blogging Heads TV.
Thank you very much.
All right.